Hey Ecofictologists, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lovis and today I want to talk about some controversy that's been the topic of conversation in the community over the last few months. If you keep track of anything ecofiction related on Twitter, you might have come across this conversation, and it's a really important topic to talk about, so I thought I'd dedicate an episode to it once my conservation and ecofiction series was over. Like any community on the internet, it's sad but true that the ecofiction, and in this case specifically the climate fiction community, is not devoid of its dramas, controversies, or bullies. Today I want to talk in more detail about climate fiction. You might have heard it referred to as cli-fi, and some of the pushback that it's received from writers and readers alike. I also want to talk about the dangers of categorization in general, a topic that several well-known authors have written about and something that's been discussed quite often in relation to this particular label. It might seem ironic to some that I'm talking about this while running a YouTube channel that to most people would look quite focused on one category of fiction, and that is a valid observation. So the first thing I want to make very clear is that I see ecofiction as an incredibly broad and inclusive term. I don't discount any genre from being allowed to be ecofiction. It can be sci-fi, fantasy, mystery, romance, thriller, you name it. Ecofiction's probably got it. I also don't think I can or should tell anyone that something they think is ecofiction isn't, just because I don't see the same connection or message that they see. This channel is all about documenting my discovery of ecofiction, but that doesn't mean it has to be the same as your discovery. I also acknowledge that ecofiction, though it's inclusive, is still a label, and labeling of any kind brings with it its own baggage, if you will, its own dangers. So it's important to focus on the stories being told rather than the term being used. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's start at the beginning and talk a little bit about climate fiction. Climate fiction has been around for decades and focuses on man-made climate change and its consequences. As we are experiencing in our own world, climate change can manifest itself in so many different ways, and climate fiction can reflect that. Whether the story focuses on temperature rise, sea level rise, droughts, food shortages, disease spread, extreme weather events, it can all be brought under the umbrella of climate fiction. Often these elements will set the backdrop for the plot to happen in Omar El-Khadd's American War, where the story is really about a second civil war happening in the US in the near future, but temperature change and sea level rise swallowing Florida and encroaching on the coasts drove the country to that breaking point. In other cases, climate change and its consequences will be the main driver of the plot. For example, in Paolo Bacigalupi's The Water Knife, the setting is defined by water shortages and droughts and refugees from that crisis, but the whole story also revolves around these water shortages and the lengths that people will go to control this most valuable resource. These examples I've just given happen to all be speculative, looking towards the future, but they don't have to be. The stories can also take place in the present day and represent how we're dealing with the situation in the here and now. Let's be honest, there's plenty of material there. I talk about Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver quite a lot, and it seems to be a common favorite, probably because it's so relatable, as the plot deals with the changes we are already witnessing in the life history patterns of iconic species like the monarch butterfly. I just spat. I don't know if anyone saw that. So climate fiction is wide-ranging and it covers all genres of fiction, whether you're looking for utopian or dystopian or something in between. From the very beginning, when I started my channel, I've been talking about the immense potential that ecofiction and all its related subgenres have in engaging the imaginations of people who might not normally engage with topics like climate change. And books are by no means the only medium we entertain ourselves with. You can find climate fiction in films and video games, and the value of representing one of, if not the greatest struggle of our time in our media is being recognized more and more. Climate fiction got a media boost of its own in 2011 with the coining of the term cli-fi by journalist Dan Bloom. The term is short and snappy and good for headlines, which is exactly what he thought climate fiction needed in order to get the attention of media outlets and newspapers to raise the alarm for climate change and get novelists and movie makers to work together. Since the term cli-fi got picked up by big-name outlets like NPR and New York Times, and has since been featured in many newspaper articles, it has definitely grown in popularity. More and more people are looking for representations, explanations, ways of dealing with what we are witnessing in our own lives. Perhaps the genre would have pushed itself into the public's awareness in time without the help of the term cli-fi, our climate situation being what it is. Who knows? But I think it's fair to say that the term being picked up as it was and giving the genre some catchy, pithy PR definitely helped get it there faster. Unfortunately, as with almost anything, there is another side to that coin. A sometimes aggressive attitude towards the definition and use of the term cli-fi has somewhat soured its otherwise positive influence, and then the question becomes, why do we need to label these stories as cli-fi, or as anything for that matter? Aren't the stories themselves enough? If you remember my interview last week with Mary Woodbury from Dragonfly Eco, she pointed out that the term ecofiction itself might never become mainstream, but the stories that fall into that category are already well on their way, and that's fine, that's good even. But with cli-fi, there is sometimes an aggressive push for the term itself to gain in recognition and to be the focus of any conversation about representing climate change in our fiction. And that has led to cases of harassment and a complete distraction from what should be a combined and cooperative effort to raise awareness of the narratives themselves. Who cares what people call them, as long as the stories are getting out there and spreading their messages to as many people as possible? And could there actually be a downside to calling them cli-fi or labeling them at all in any way, for that matter? Could this debate actually be hurting the reception of these stories? Jeff VanderMeer, the author of the best-selling Southern Reach trilogy, among others, wrote in his blog post that as soon as you label something, you start othering everything that doesn't fall into your definition of that category, and that can lead to a commodification and a rendering invisible. Setting boundaries on a category can lead to a kind of blinkering effect, almost a preemptive definition instead of just letting the stories define themselves. In this way, you could completely discount stories that might represent an unexplored aspect of how our world is changing, which might be linked to climate change as a background reality, even though it's not part of the main plot. Are these stories now somehow invalid or less useful? No, they're not. There are those who would say that as our world continues to change around us, any storytelling taking place in the present day or looking to the future is climate fiction, because there's no way of thinking about the future or thinking about the present without acknowledging this struggle. And for several authors and climate fiction enthusiasts, the bullying around the term cli-fi has caused them to take a step back from social media, from using their voice and platform to promote their stories and messages, and that just helps nobody at all. In fact, it's counterproductive. In an article in The Guardian, Amitav Ghosh, the author of Gun Island and The Hungry Tide, among others, wrote about the public perception of climate fiction and how it's often relegated out of the realm of serious fiction and into science fiction, either because of personal preference or a misunderstanding of how science-based and extrapolative science fiction can be. Assigning a label to anything immediately also assigns it a type of baggage. People who see climate fiction, they might go, oh, I don't like science fiction, I won't read that. Or, oh, well, I don't want to be preached to, so I'm not going to read that. Or, well, that's going to be depressing. Labels can be useful. Our brains are wired to think in a Bayesian kind of way, drawing conclusions from prior knowledge, and labels and categories can help us with that. But if our goal is to make our narratives representing climate fiction accessible to as many people as possible, perhaps it's not conducive to give them maybe a false prior in this case. As for me, I see both the good and the not so good side of climate fiction. I love that fiction portraying man-made climate change and its consequences is being given more attention in the media and is being represented in books and in films. I think it's incredibly important that our media reflects the struggles of our time. Not talking about it and not finding new ways to communicate about it is sticking our head in the sand, which is often the easiest thing to do and is so tempting, believe me, I know. And I think fiction has so much potential in opening discussion about such topics in a way that's not so overwhelming. But it should be up to each reader and definitely each author to decide how they want to label a book. They should not feel constrained by another's classification of whether a book is cli-fi or not. So I think the term cli-fi as a marketing technique to point the finger at our media, not just books but films and music and theatre and video games as well, to represent our impact on our environment is an incredibly positive thing. It wakes people up to the need to talk about these things, and if it works, then it will normalize talking about them. But I don't think it has to have the black and white strict boundaries. As we start to acknowledge that climate change is changing our way of life, climate fiction is going to leak into all genres, and I think that that's a good thing. So that is where I'm going to leave you today, hopefully with a bit of an open mind, an acknowledgement of the dangers of categorizing anything, and some tolerance towards people who might not see things the same way as you do. You have every right to decide what and how you read. You don't have the right to decide what and how other people read. I'd love to hear what you think about this topic, so leave all of your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you would like to continue to explore ecofiction in a safe, supportive community where bullying behaviour of any kind will absolutely not be tolerated, then join Mary Woodbury and I over on our Rewilding Our Stories Discord server and find other ecofiction lovers like yourself. Also, if you like what I do and would like to support me, head on over to my Patreon page over on patreon.com/ecofictology. Collect a couple of perks for only a small amount a month, which is small to you, but buys me the next book that you see reviewed on this channel. Well, and that's it from me, so I'll see you next week, Ecofictologists.